Ready?
Good
Go ahead.
afternoon. Okay, ready?
Yep.
Good afternoon, and welcome to one work, five questions. And last week we discussed query number 17 of Jefferson's religious freedom notes on the state of Virginia, the section on religious freedom. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to work off of that, and we're going to discuss the overall structure and key points in the publication notes on the state of Virginia that, of course, Jefferson wrote, and that was Jefferson's only book that he wrote. And so we'll look at it from a macro point of view. So without further ado, Donna, you want to introduce everybody?
Sure. I'm Donna Vitek, and there's Jeffy. He's the star of the show. Jeffy. He hears my voice, and he's got to come to the camera. He's used to. It's been a year and a half, I think, or almost 2 years. So he's like,
Well,
"Who's
and
that?"
I'm in my quaint little Ukrainian village in western, what used to be Western Ukraine, Galicia. I won't tell you where exactly, but to leave that to your imagination. After the video, I'll probably go for a dip in the stream and back to me.
Skinny dip. Anyway, okay. And this is Dave, our host, and Dr. Holachak. That's the guy with the Ukrainian village behind him. Yeah. Are you in Ukraine right now?
I am. I told you I'm in Western Ukraine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Western Ukraine. Okay. So Dr. Holachak, for credentials, he has a PhD in philosophy and history, and he's taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. He has written 27 books, right? 27? 27 books on Thomas Jefferson and over 200 essays. And that the location of his books and essays will be in the description of the video, correct? You'll put all that?
Maybe.
Links? Okay.
Maybe. I'm lazy
Okay.
sometimes. I forgetful.
Well, okay, so I'm Donna Vitek. You can contact me through YouTube if you want to find his stuff. I can give you a link to find his work. So with our show, One Work, Five Questions, Dave and I will ask Dr. Holachak 5 questions on the work of Thomas Jefferson, and today it's on the notes on the state of Virginia. Woohoo! I'm excited. I can't wait to hear the answers. So starting off, we'll start with question number 1. What was the main purpose of Notes on the State of Virginia, and for whom was it written?
Let me read what he wrote. Jefferson was asked by a certain Joseph Jones, who was affiliated, a representative of the state of Virginia, and Francois Barbé Marbois had prepared a list of 22 questions that he would send to a delegate of every one of the 13 states. He wanted to know information about the nature, the resources, the animals, and cultural aspects of each state. And he sends his 22 queries to Joseph Jones, who realizes he's not the person to do that, and he gives that to Thomas Jefferson. So the main purpose, let me read what Jefferson writes in his autobiography. He says, before I had left America, that is to say in the year 1781, I'd received a letter from Monsieur de Marbois of the French legation in Philadelphia, informing me he had been instructed by his government to obtain such statistical accounts of the different states of our union as might be useful for their information, and addressing to me a number of queries relative to the state of Virginia. I had always made it a practice whenever an opportunity occurred of obtaining any information of our country, which might be of use to me in any station, public or private, to commit it to writing. These memoranda were on loose papers, bundled up without order, and difficult of recurrence when I had occasion for a particular one. I thought this a good occasion to embody their substance, which I did in the order of Mr. Marbois' queries, so as to answer his wish and arrange them for my own use. Initially, what he's saying is that the purpose of the notes on Virginia was just to answer his questions, right? Then he realized, well, I have tons of slips of paper on which everywhere Jefferson goes, he takes his pen and makes notes on things, peculiarities of Virginia, things he thinks that's noteworthy. And he always wanted to put these in some order. Now, he makes it sound like these slips of paper were sort of, everywhere to be found. And that's not the case because Jefferson was too orderly for that. So the idea was to answer the questions. Then he realized I can answer them in a systematic and orderly way. So Marbois asks 22 queries. Jefferson changes the queries to some extent and adds another query and changes the order so that his first 7 queries relate to the nature of Virginia. The last 16 queries, 7 and 16 is 23, right? 16 queries relate to cultural aspects of Virginia. And Jefferson slips off, of course, to talk about other things. And, so it's a great opportunity to make some order, to take these slips of paper, put them in book form, and, arrange his thoughts in some systematic way. So he puts these in an order. And, Jefferson's very anal. So, he had to do that. He had to change the questions and restructure his queries so that they're more systematically arranged. His answers are systematic. Initially, he proposes that these will be written. He goes to France. He wants to get the book published in Virginia or Philadelphia. It's too expensive. He knows it can be done cheaper in France. Takes the manuscript to Paris, has in English 200 copies printed, and he's arranging to send them to political allies as well as his friends. And he wants to send numerous copies to William and Mary College for the students, for their edification. So there's a political intent here, as well as other sorts of intentions. And what happens is that one of his buddies, whose name eludes me right now, dies, who has a copy of Jefferson's notes. And that copy gets into the hands of a French publisher, and the French publisher, knowing it's Jefferson stuff, arranges to have this translated into French and published in France. Jefferson learns of this and is outraged because it's a terrible translation, and it's changing the meaning of what Jefferson was doing. And so Jefferson arranges for another French person of his acquaintance to retranslate it, in French and put it back but this person doesn't do that. He just mutilates it more. He interpolates and adds and so forth. So Jefferson finally, in 1787, has the manuscript published in English, and he's not entirely happy with that. He's happiest with the first translation, the first publication, which is the 200 copies. And the one that we have to us right now, I have William Peden's version here, 1954, I think. Jefferson was less happy with that than he was with the first. So the idea is it's not going to be I'll add this and we'll move on next question. When the book gets stolen and translated into French, Jefferson realized it's made accessible to the public. So he takes something that's supposed to be not meant for public consumption and allows it by Stockdale in England at the time to translate it and to give it in the original English and let it be accessible to the general public. So it wasn't intended for general public. It gets, made for the general public, but that's out of Jefferson's hands. Was that clear enough, or was I confusing?
Yeah, no.
Sorry, what did you say? Can you repeat that? No, I'm joking.
There was a long history there.
No, don't tell him that. Okay, well, I don't know if there's going to be much meat to number 2, but maybe what we can do is drill down a little bit further into some of the more specific issues here. What is the proper way to unpackage and or understand the book. Now we got the macro assessment of that, but what about each section of the book? Is there a kind of a clever way to go about understanding the book itself and the topics?
Yeah, here I have to hypothesize. I have to give my theory.
That's fine.
There is in my book on Notes on the State of Virginia that has just come out this year, and I'll show it in a bit. I say there is the alphabet soup hypothesis. Let me share screen with my book. Do I have it up? There is the alphabet soup hypothesis. And by that, I mean the adherents of the alphabet soup. I think it's a beautiful picture there. Adherents of the alphabet soup hypothesis think it's just a sort of strange mishmash of ideas thrown together without any really concern for arrangement, right? I'll go into this. In most people, Duma Malone, Merrill Peterson, and other people like that think that this is the correct interpretation. My favorite writer, Pete Onoff, thinks the same. And whatever Peter thinks, I agree with. So just teasing. There are problems with the alphabet soup thesis. As I give my thesis, I'll make that plain. The one I think biggest problem is Jefferson was so anal. He would never be happy with throwing out something just so disorderly, so discursive. And if you read it carefully, I think it doesn't read that way. People think that it is, because Jefferson sometimes goes off on tangents to give philosophical views, to express a philosophical opinion or political opinion. He does that often. And so he does have these tangents in there. Because of that, people think that the whole book itself is without order. There is the I know, Dave, your favorite term, this the deconstructivist thesis. They acknowledge that Jefferson never really wrote, as I would just said, wrote elliptically, never wrote, he was not a wandering writer. He was a very talented, patient, and to the point writer for the most part. These people think that that Notes on Virginia, that it has a structure, but you have to read into it to get the structure. You have to see beyond. The deconstructivists always think you can't read anything literally. You have to see beyond the literal meaning of the words to get at it. Now, once I'm not very happy with deconstructivism at all, because once you take the view that that deconstruction is the proper mode, you can get anything you want out of the text. Read underneath.
Hey, what a shock!
What a shock! I know that's your favorite. I think Jefferson was so well immersed with Greek literature. There was a huge distinction in early Greek thinking, pre-Socratic and all well into Socrates through Aristotle of nomos, meaning nature, nomos meaning culture, and physis, we get our word physics from, meaning nature. Jefferson orders the first 7 queries, which are physis, physics, like physics, which are nature. They're all natural, talking about the mountains, ravines, and everything, of Virginia. Then he goes into nomos or nomoi, the cultural aspects. Mm-hmm. These words were thrown about so often in Greek, and Jefferson read the Greeks. And I think it just reads, you have nature, 7 queries, and then 13 queries on 16 queries on culture. In my view, is that there is a sort of dialectic going on here. It's a guidebook with philosophical and political insights. So what Jefferson wanted you to do, and this is where my thesis might seem a little unattractive to people, but I still think it's correct, wanted you to read the natural aspects and then go on to balance them off with some of his cultural insights and go back and forth. So there was an invitation almost, if you're reading about the soil in the natural, there's an invitation to jump right immediately in the cultural aspects to agriculture and to look at how nature and culture interplay. So there's that sort of dialectical tension.
Is it fair to look at it kind of like, and I don't mean this literally, just as a frame of reference, I guess, as a sort of a geography book, whether it was intended or not, that first you had the physical geography element followed by the cultural. Is that fair? Or I realize it's probably much more than that, but I'm trying to get my head around.
If we understand geography, Gaia is Greek for land and stuff. So if we understand land metaphorically in the cultural aspects, then yeah. But I want to call it, it's a guidebook.
Yeah.
It's a sort of book like Whately. Whately talked about the gardens of the pleasure gardens of England, and Jefferson takes that book with him when he examines the gardens. I think Jefferson would have thought for someone visiting Virginia, you'd have Notes on Virginia in your pocket and you'd pull it out. And when they're talking about the natural bridge, if that's what you mean, yes, that's what he had in mind.
Sort of a scientific inquiry into the history, culture, physical environment, all that. I don't know how else to equate it to something else, because it's good, like a lot of geography books, it's got a little bit of every discipline in it. Philosophy, science, it's just something I thought about that it goes along with what you're saying.
Hence the attractiveness of the alphabet soup thesis, because he does so much and he does go off on tangents. People tend to think there was no structure to it. No, there was a structure to it, but he just had he had some stuff to say, like he has a fight with Buffon about the inferiority of the New World, and that would be a great real Thomas Jefferson versus Buffon.
Oh gosh!
I think we did an episode.
What's that?
We did an episode in One Word, 5 Questions on that. I think
that
we
sounds
did, familiar.
but I mean, the idea was, at least we talked.
No photographs of moose, okay?
Oh, I think we did have a buffalo.
But it wasn't so silly as people thought, because the New World wasn't tamed. The trees weren't chopped down, and everybody thought because of that, the heat, right? It would be colder and wetter, because the heat wasn't allowed to penetrate to the earth. So because of the trees and the foliage, and be wetter because the sun wasn't allowed to dry things. And so he says the New World's colder and wetter. That's not a hypothesis that he puts forth because he's visited New World. It's just common sense when you don't clear it. He's not talking about it being naturally. Buffon thought, for example, many decades from the time he's writing it, it could be the same as the Old World, right?
Yeah.
It just was because it wasn't cleared and cleaned by people. People hadn't been in the New World for so long. So, I mean, my view is it's sort of, I dispense with the alphabet soup thesis. I think nothing of deconstructionism. I think it's bullshit. So I don't do much with that. Anytime as an analytic philosopher, I take people seriously. I think my view is there are times you don't take Jefferson literally, but whenever you do that, you have to have a very good explanation for why we shouldn't. And we need to appeal for other things that he's written to justify it.
Exactly.
You don't like that, Donna?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Where are we at?
Yeah.
Question 3?
Yeah. Question 3. What are some of the popular misperceptions related to the book?
I like this question because I get to play with what I did in my book. And I think this is a really, really fine book that I've written. I started off with wanting to do Notes on Virginia, include the book and have a commentary and footnotes or whatever. And the commentary got so large. And I realized everybody who wrote on Notes on Virginia, there were problems with what they wrote, namely because they weren't familiar with science, especially. And they didn't have Jefferson's sort of encyclopedic understanding of things. Not that I do, I don't. But to deal with Jefferson, you have to, in some sense, be on his playing field. You have to know languages. You have to know Greek and Latin. You have to know science. You have to have read Newton and Francis Bacon and things like that, and studied early. You have to know Hippocratic medicine from the time of Aristotle, because the medicine Jefferson's today was not substantially different. Now,
And Greek political science philosophy.
well, Jefferson said that was obsolete, but you needed to know that because everybody in Jefferson's day read Aristotle. The alphabet soup thesis, again, I'll talk about the number of adherents. Why was that attractive? Because Jefferson made it attractive. In his advertisement in the 1787 edition, he writes, the following notes were written in Virginia in the year 1781. So, John, you want to say 1785. Jefferson says 1781. Somewhat corrected and enlarged in the winter of 1782, in answers to queries proposed by the author by a foreigner of distinction, then Marbois, then residing among us. The subjects are all treated imperfectly, some scarcely touched on. That's why people buy the alphabet soup. So Jefferson is just being modest or overly humble. I just scarcely touch on these, and they're all imperfect. To apologize for this by developing the circumstances of the time and place of their composition after he's kicked out of the governorship, after his wife dies, would be to open wounds which have already bled enough. To these circumstances, some of their imperfections may with truth be ascribed the great mass to the want of information and want of talents in the writer. Now, people, a lot of the scholars, and I'm gonna dump on these scholars, say, oh, Jefferson, as usual, mock humility. I'm so tired of Jefferson being falsely humble. He writes this ass-kicking book, and then he's saying it's all imperfect. No. Try writing a book like that. I have. I've offered a commentary on Jefferson's Bible. It was horrific. It was difficult to do because I'm not a biblical scholar, number one. So you have to have a familiarity with the Bible that I didn't have. And you have to follow, writing what Jefferson's writing is a severely daunting task. He's not being humble. He's being truthful, right? He talks of Buffon's works. Buffon spends his life writing on the history of animals and plants and minerals. And he's writing, I don't know how many volumes over the course of decades. And Jefferson, when he refutes Buffon to some extent, says, this is a very small thing because it's amazing that a person can study and write so much and make such few mistakes. Jefferson is writing a very difficult book to write, and he knows there are going to be many mistakes in his book. That's all. He's being honest. It's a humbling experience. I've done works like that. My book on Jefferson's Bible was a humbling experience, right? I'm sure if someone read it carefully, you might say, well, Holacek got this wrong, got that wrong. It needs to be corrected. But that's just, I wanted to write the book and I did. Now, the alphabet soup thesis is generated in large part because of Jefferson's advertisement. Adherents to the view are Gilbert Chenard, great Jefferson French scholar, Dumas Malone, the first Thomas Jefferson scholar. I won't read what he says. It's in Merrill Peterson, the second great Jefferson scholar. Douglas Wilson, who was an extraordinary Jeffersonian scholar, never wrote a biography of Jefferson, but always focused on small things of Jefferson and just got immersed in the details. One of my favorite scholars, Lawrence Kaplan, our favorite, Joseph Ellis, Frank Shuffleton, who was William Peden, who did the edition of Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. Who else here? Alf Mapp, who was a member of the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society, Henry Steele Commanger, Leonard Levy, Charles Miller, and Adrian Koch, right? I will read, I will leave off on that. Do I have something from anyone? I'm not going to read anything that these people have read. There is also the other view, the deconstructionist thesis, which argues that we can make sense of what seems to be a sort of skimble-scamble appearance of the book when one penetrates beyond the veneer, right? We don't look at the actual words, but Jefferson says superior courts, the High Court of Chancery. He really means Sally Hemings or something like that. We got to read in to what? When Jefferson is talking about the mulatto earth, as one author states, he's thinking of Sally Hemings, right? His mulatto lover. right? And once you do that, you run into, right? So adherents of the deconstructionist thesis are Robert Dawidoff, who hates Jefferson, never had anything nice to say. He says the notes abound in this special sort of Jeffersonian vision, his way of reading the scientific tea leaves and picturing the future. In the book, Virginia becomes a scientifically delineated in Republican paradise, the right setting for the free government Jefferson has in mind. He calls it a didactic fantasy meant to instill what is necessary, what is that necessary class, the kinds of virtues and habits and self-image that such citizens must have if the republic is survived, right? The worst, I mean, other adherents are George Allen Davey, Robert Ferguson, Harold Hellenbrand, who's a fine scholar, Andrew Burstein, a disciple of Peter Onoff, but a fine scholar, David Tucker, Matthew Cordova Franklin, Keith Thompson, James and Alan Golden, Thomas Dicken. The motivation for my book came from people who were deconstructionists, namely Dustin Gish and David Klinghardt, who published a few years ago their interpretation of Notes on Virginia and got everything, in my estimation, egregiously wrong. A friend of mine, Garrett Ward Shelton, sends me an email and says, Mark, you got to read this book. He nails it. I read, he sent me his copy of the book. He says, I love this book. And I said, Garrett, hold off. These guys get everything wrong. I said, please don't publish your, I don't know if he published, I think he published his review, positive review. Obviously didn't agree with me, but Gish and Klinghardt argue post hoc fallacy. They argue Jefferson, even though he says he only got 200 copies and they were meant for friends and other Republicans and for students at William and Mary, he didn't really mean that, they say. He says it's not a coincidence that he's writing this book while the constitutional debates are going on. Because he's writing them while the constitutional debates go on, he really wanted to send the book to the Continental Congress so that all would read it and work the Constitution out to make it a Jeffersonian Constitution. Small problem with that thesis is that Jefferson never anywhere says anything like that. Nowhere. And everywhere he says it's not meant for public consumption. It's 200 copies and that's that. So we have to just say everything Jefferson says on who the readership was and why he's writing it is just false. He lied through his teeth the whole time. Then they come up with this story that Jefferson actually goes to the Bible and takes the Pentateuch, the 5 books, and he's basing the structure of Notes on Virginia on the Pentateuch. Where the hell do you see that? I mean, I'm reading this and pulling out my hair. And if you get a copy of my book, I have an appendix where I have a long book report on this book. And I wrote my whole book just because I thought their book was so badly written and received such high attention. Every scholar thinks this is the last word on it. It just is, the fact that he wrote it during the constitutional debate meant that was his purpose. That's post hoc fallacy. He wrote it just prior to the Constitution, so that had to be his purpose, right? We might as well want to say, because the French Revolution just happened after publication, he wrote it to incite the French Revolution.
Actually, I think it's the other way around, because the Notes on the State of Virginia were written prior to the Constitutional Convention. I was wondering if Article 2, Section 3, Clause 1, that requires the president to do a State of the Union address, I was wondering if that was inspired by Jefferson's note on the state of Virginia.
No, I don't think his Notes on Virginia had any influence at all. And Jefferson didn't want it to have any influence on the convention. He wasn't there.
I know, but what I'm saying is that maybe they saw what the work Jefferson did, and they thought, well, this would be good for the entire Union, for the president to do this.
The people about whom you're talking did not have access to the book at the time.
Oh, they didn't have access.
People in the Congress, it had no influence whatsoever on the debates in the Continental Congress. And
they didn't. They had.
Yeah, the problem is that these people have a vivid imagination, and there's a plausibility in terms of the temporal plausibility to their views. If something prior to another thing, if something happens prior to another thing, it's in position to be its cause simply because it occurred prior to it. but that doesn't make something a cause, right? Again, like I just said, the notes on Virginia were written prior to the French Revolution, so they caused it. Well, that doesn't follow. So I'll just leave it at that because we got a couple more questions. We got like 9 minutes left.
9 minutes, yeah. Okay, number 4. What does the book tell us about Jefferson's views on subjects such as government, individual liberty, science and philosophy, and the like? The like
Well,
gives you latitude.
Yeah, I can't answer all those because
Sure.
I talk about all those things in my book.
Understand.
What impresses me in the natural queries is the employment of what is called a hypothetical deductive reasoning, where you put forth a hypothesis today. Newton was familiar with this, and then you deduce certain consequences, right? And you put them to the test. Positive test being evidence for hypothesis. He talks about the formation of fossils high in the foothills, right, of the mountains near Virginia. Jefferson wants to know how the fossils get there. What are fossils? He entertains 3 hypotheses, and he rejects all 3. The point is he's constantly, as I say in my books, observing, writing down, measuring things, and then critiquing them using a scientific method. He was very scientifically oriented and very mathematically oriented. It's meticulous. It blows you away. In queries 4 and 5, he gives us another mistake people make is they talk about, well, Jefferson is talking about the natural bridge in Harper's Ferry where you have the collision of 2 mighty rivers. Jefferson changes his mind and it seems like he's campaigning for coming down to visit the bridge and all that because his writing changes. It does change, but if anybody ever read anything about the aesthetical literature of the time, right? If they read Smith and other people, Lord Keynes and other people, William Hogarth that Jefferson read, he's talking about, when he's describing the natural bridge, for example, he's contrasting beauty with the sublime. Beauty, Jefferson says, and here something, my thoughts here are thoughts that no one in the world has discussed. So that alone, I think, is worth the price of the book. Jefferson is looking at the initial impression you get when you see the magnificent natural bridge. You're in awe, you're afraid, you're just like entering a beautiful Gothic church. It's dark, it's imposing, and you feel small. The bridge makes you feel small, and you think of dark thoughts and you're afraid. But then you compose yourself, and as you compose yourself, you see beauty, right? It's almost a biological reaction. And I talk about Jefferson here as giving us a human biological reaction to what is sublime and what is beautiful. And if you haven't read the literature of the sublime and beautiful of Jefferson's day, you're not going to understand what Jefferson was doing. Just following the aestheticians. No one apparently has taken the time to read that, so they're confused. So he's talking about the sublime. There's a lot said in there when he talks about constitutions, about individual liberty. He gives his views in query 14, I think, on laws, science. He goes off on philosophical divagations and so forth. And I'll leave it at that. There's so much to unpack there. I can't answer the question fully, but it's a question that we could spend the whole 1 Word 5 questions on.
Wow. Okay. Question number 5. Are there any other key takeaways regarding the publication that are noteworthy or worthy of consideration?
Well, this sort of takes us back to the last question, question 4. Without being redundant, I could go in and talk about other things as well. But let me leave it up to you two. Do you have any questions that you have from familiarity with his notes on Virginia that you might want me to discuss that, to help us understand Jefferson's thinking? On government, on liberty, Peden's book is an excellent commentary on it. And
I understand that the notes on the state of Virginia include a myriad of subjects. It does, let's face it.
Yeah.
But what really kind of impresses me about it is that he has used as you mentioned, the science of that day, and a lot of what he's doing scientifically actually, comes in after his day. Anyway, he's doing that, and he's looking at a brand new area of the world, new people, and he is analyzing them in that area very systematically and scientifically and dispassionately. I mean, that's amazing when you think about it, when you think about where most people were, even learned people of that era.
Yeah.
He's ahead of his time.
Oh, he was, and his work was it's considered to be one of the great early American works by any person, and it earned him, independently of his Declaration of Independence and so forth. I would say so. I'll add some here that no one, again, I take pride in being able to see things other people haven't. And maybe it's my persistency in that, having, a lot of people write a book on Jefferson, they move on, there's nothing else to write. I don't get that. I think if you do science and you do the languages, Jefferson, you have his excitement about languages, you'll see things other people. How many Jefferson scholars have really taken the time to read Lawrence Stern's novels?
Right? Oh, probably hardly any.
Yeah, I have. He says Stern was my favorite writer, so I had to go.
Exactly.
When I read that, I have to go to read Stern. Look at query 3. Seaports. This is a question by Marbois. Jefferson gives one sentence. Having no ports but our rivers and creeks, this query has been answered under the preceding one. So here's the question. No one's ever asked this question again. Why not? If the question's been answered in the preceding query 2, why not include it and not even have a query 3? Why do you have a one-sentence query? Anybody ever think of that? Does that make sense? It leads to an embarrassing sort of asymmetry.
Yeah.
Now, there's my Dr. Jefferson. Lawrence Stern and his Tristram Shandy, Jefferson, Tristram Shandy, gentlemen. I would say gentlemen, I said Jefferson. Tristram Shandy Jefferson. He has a chapter in that book, which is one sentence. How do you have a chapter that's one sentence? Is Jefferson playing with the reader here? Because easily could have kept to 22 queries like Marbois and just said, not even had a question on seaports and have a sentence in the previous query saying, Marbois' query of seaports, I'm addressing in this second query. But he includes a one sentence. Is he having fun?
That's interesting.
It is.
Yeah, it's really.
But you have to understand, Stern was his favorite writer, and Stern does that in his book. When you read the book, you start laughing, thinking, "The hell are you doing, Stern?" It's just talk about divagations, and you have a one sentence chapter, and then it goes on to the next. It's sort of like, are you really having fun with us? Are you playing with us? So is this an instance of Jefferson's really dark, deep, and unapproachable sense of humor? I'll leave that. What are we doing next week, Miss Vitek? You had something you wanted to do?
Yes, we'll be discussing, for the real Thomas Jefferson,